Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you news as it relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yisrael Hawkins. Well, we know with the winter season coming, we're dealing with a lot of flu vaccines, but some of those vaccines have actually turned out to be deadly for some people. There's a new kind of poverty that we see taking place in California, although not necessarily new to those who live there, but new maybe to the rest of the United States and Silicone Valley. And we're going to look at some of the things in regards to the U.S. war machine and its effects on its neighbors. But first, we're going to start off with asking you a question as to just how safe are those heavily advertised flu shots? Well, one man learned how deadly they can be. Shane Morgan and his wife got their flu shots on November 2nd, but instead of avoiding illness, the very next day he came down with what he thought was a bad cold. But that was followed by his eyesight starting to fail, the inability to walk, and numbness in his hands. Well, his wife rushed him to the ER where he had to be put into an induced coma while spending 23 days in the hospital.
Well, doctors confirmed that Morgan had the Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological disease linked to the flu shot, according to the CDC, but they said it varies based on the strain. Now, the couple said that this was the last year they were getting the flu shot, stating it's just not worth the risk. Now, Morgan does have to go through physical therapy that could take up to a year to get back to full health.
Can you imagine taking what many say an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure, to take a flu vaccine, but end up having a year ahead of recovery, right? Not to mention the coma, the 23 days of his life that was kind of put on hold as a result of that Guillain-Barré. Well, another flu-related incident, this time a political TV commentator and writer, 26-year-old Bree Payton, died shortly after contracting the H1N1 flu and meningitis, as confirmed by CT scans, according to her parents. Well, she was a seemingly healthy young woman and sadly died just 24 hours after a friend found her unconscious in her apartment and, of course, quickly called 911.
Well, RT's Peter Lavelle's Crosstalk show had some guests on it that where the focus was not on free speech, but a lack thereof. Now, on the program, he set the stage by asking several of the guests after mentioning the firings of at least 2 teachers who were fired from their jobs, a Virginia teacher because they didn't use the correct pronoun to address the students, and the other, a Texas elementary teacher, which is actually the one that we mentioned in our last broadcast, because she refused to sign a pro-Israel oath. Now, his question was, how did we get from protecting speech to enforcing speech?
Well, one of his guests said, I think that the thought is, through the application of force, we can create a perfect society. If you control what someone must say, then you control how they think, you control their mind. Well, the idea is the use of force is okay if it makes us safe, but as we know from foreign policy, it doesn't. Well, Mr. Lavelle, agreeing with the guests, said that this is a form of mind control and said if you don't agree with what's being said, then you just have to shut up and nod, signifying that, of course, that's the only option to keep someone from suffering the consequences of not saying something that everyone can agree with.
Well, the U.S. and Israel is leaving UNESCO, or the United Nations Scientific, Educational, and Cultural Organization. Now, this decision goes back to 2017 due to what the U.S. says is the organization's anti-Semitic and pro-Arab bias. Now, the U.S. stopped paying the UNESCO dues back in 2011 during the Obama administration, subsequently losing its voting rights in 2013.
President Trump removed the U.S. as a member of the body, which was followed by Israel. The straw that broke the camel's back came after the organization decided to make the old city of Hebron a World Heritage Site, recognizing the contested territory as belonging to Palestine.
Well, Ukraine is scheduled to end hundreds of years of religious dominance by the Russian Orthodox Church. In Kiev, in front of the San Sofia Cathedral, thousands gathered there as religious leaders met to formalize the split and enlarge an already existing Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Now, the head of the world's Orthodox Christians in Istanbul had already ruled that the split should go ahead in October. Now, that decision infuriated the Russian church and denounced it as a schism and severed ties with Istanbul.
Well, this ended over 330 years of Russia, which is the world's largest Orthodox Church, acting as Ukraine's spiritual guardian. But this dispute is just as much about politics as it is about religious doctrine. And if you remember, Russia annexed Ukraine back in 2015 under a lot of criticism, that came from global countries, global leaders saying that this is not something they should do. They went ahead and proceeded with it anyway.
Well, for more information on the developments in Ukraine, we now turn to our correspondent, Larry McGee. Larry, where have things gone now here with Ukraine and the Sea of Azov?
At this point, the Ukraine is reportedly sending warships back to the Sea of Azov. This follows, of course, behind their recent skirmish with Russia, where 3 of the country's vessels were seized and 24 of their sailors were captured off the coast of Crimea. The Secretary for the National Defense and Security Council of the Ukraine released a statement saying that Russia's aggression will not stop the country's plans to create a naval group in the Sea of Azov. If we stop and retreat, he stated, Russia will actually fulfill its task of capturing the Sea of Azov, present the world with self-determined new sea borders in the Black Sea, de facto legitimizing the occupation of Crimea. In response, President Putin is calling for normalized relations between the two nations, despite the fact that he suspects deliberate provocation on behalf of Kiev. The Russian leader believes it was the Ukraine's intent to sacrifice some of its soldiers in the Kerch Strait due to the confessions of some of the captured sailors who reportedly admitted that they were under orders to ignore any requests coming from Russian warships to stop. Kiev has denied the truthfulness of those statements and has condemned them as being coerced. The leader of the nation has also sought to establish martial law within the country, citing the need to be prepared in the event of a Russian invasion. Critics say, however, that the move, which comes during election time, is an effort by President Poroshenko to hold on to his office, despite only having 10% of the nation's vote, since the declaration of martial law could potentially postpone elections indefinitely. As the arms race between Moscow and Washington heats up, President Putin has expressed strong alarm over the indefinite consequences that could stem from the U.S.'s recently withdrawing from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. The Russian head says that the threat of nuclear war should not be underestimated. The estimates of those who are currently doing without shelter in the United States is dismaying and drastically increasing. Here's a short video detailing some of what the homeless are having to contend with on Los Angeles' Skid Row.
Well, you know, the whole cleanup is suspect and politically charged. We already know the only reason why come they out here, is to take people's brother.
It's a Wednesday on Skid Row in Los Angeles. Activist Steve Richardson is alerting the homeless that the sanitation department and LAPD will be coming through for street cleanings. The city calls it Operation Healthy Streets, an effort to prevent public health outbreaks in homeless encampments. But for the homeless, the daily sweeps can also mean having what few possessions they own taken, setting them back even further. Skid Row has long been synonymous with homelessness in America. But today, homeless encampments in Los Angeles have sprouted up across the city, from Hollywood to neighborhoods like Echo Park to South LA. And unlike in most major cities where the vast majority of the homeless live in shelters, in LA, the majority of homeless live on the streets, in plain sight, in vehicles, tents, makeshift encampments, with nowhere to go. Lieutenant Howard Wong of LA's Sanitation Department works with teams of inspectors who deal with the homeless and public health hazards.
Types of health hazards out here can be biological, chemical.
He took us to see what he encounters on a regular basis.
Abandoned urine containers, biological waste such as feces or sewage located on the public areas, the sidewalks, the parks, on the beach. We have been receiving more requests to conduct homeless cleanups, but our resources are stretched thin.
Lieutenant Wong says the department can have 10 to 13 teams a day conducting operations like this across the city. There are daily interactions like this playing out as the homeless population in LA has spiked. In 2012, it was roughly 36,000. This year, it's 53,000. In recent years, the city and homeless advocates have battled over the responsibilities of the police and sanitation departments and the rights of the homeless. Homeless advocates have argued that the police go too far by taking and destroying personal property. And in 2012, the courts agreed. As a result, in LA, the homeless are allowed to keep up to 60 gallons of their own belongings. Anything more, the city has to bag, tag, and store in a sanitation facility on Skid Row called the Bin.
So this is the bin right here. This is the city's only homeless storage facility. And so no matter where you at around the city, whether you in Hollywood, whether you in Venice, whether you in South Central, San Pedro, if the cops confiscate your property on the streets, it's packed out and it's delivered right here.
Critics say the bin is really only practical for those who live on Skid Row. It's a 5-hour walk for the homeless on Venice Beach, a 90-minute ride by bus or bike. Anything not claimed within 90 days is destroyed.
Due to the public failure of increasing homelessness, lawmakers in California are starting to get involved, with one bill in particular being proposed by State Senator Scott Wiener to require cities and counties to provide a bed to those without a home before asking them to move. The Senate official says permanent housing is the ultimate goal, but the state must have places where people can go and sleep. And at present, he says, there are counties with 0 beds or very few beds, or they are only open during the winter. The senator stated that California cities and counties needed to be pushed and supported to do more, but those who are also concerned about the issue hope that that support means resources, since the state's politicians have become notorious for not putting their money where their mouth is. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
Well, the right to shelter bill, as the man was announcing, Katan, is an idea at least to help with that homeless situation there. Not too many other people have come up with ideas except just clean off all the stuff, throw it away, and move on to a different area. So at least they're making a little bit of effort to try to help.
Yeah, hopefully they'll look into some ways to actually not just hand things out to people, but give people some hope and direction by getting them established in work and enabling them to kind of provide for themselves. And instead of just giving people handouts, it really doesn't solve the problem. But like you said, it is a step in the right direction to kind of make a change.
Right.
And that's
Jobs
what
would definitely be a benefit to those
That's for sure.
people.
People being able to work and take care of themselves. Well, Silicon Valley, we know it as home to hundreds of technology firms like NASA Supercomputing Division and tech giant Google, who currently has 20,000 employees. Now, with an unemployment rate of 2.5%, that of the national average, it and an immediate income of $100,000 per year, you would think people are living the high life. But in Mountain View, California, in the heart of Silicone Valley, the cost of living is just as high as the income.
Well, Mountain View Mayor Pat Showalter explains so many people have come here that their rents, just because of supply and demand, have gone through the roof. Now, the median rent for an apartment or house in Mountain View today is $4,390 a month. That's a 54% increase since the year 2012. Now, the mayor says it doesn't matter whether you make $100,000 a year or not. You haven't planned for a 54% rent increase, and it's caused a lot of people to be displaced.
Well, I can imagine. Right now, there is a small but growing number of residents who have decided to live in recreational vehicles, vans, and even cars to reduce their living expenses. The RVs and other vehicles can be seen lining some streets, often across from parks or office buildings.
Now, one couple, Dennis and Marcia Crispleeb, say their RV is bigger than some studio apartments they've looked at. Marcia explains that while there was one apartment that did appeal to them, being in a safe neighborhood, the rent was almost $2,400 a month, which would take a huge chunk of her salary that is supporting both her and her husband, who is currently looking for work.
Marcia earns $65,000 a year working as an environmental consultant for NASA, but says, I can still only afford things I could afford when I was making minimum wage because everything goes to rent. Well, the Crispleebs would like to park their RV in a campsite with the proper hookups. However, the only RV park in Mountain View no longer exists.
Last year, a developer purchased the land and shut down the park, turning it into a construction site for new million-dollar townhouses. While 126 cars and motorhomes were counted lining Mountain View streets last summer, it is likely to increase if the cost of housing does not come down soon.
You see, it seems like that they would be able to, control that to some extent to provide housing for the people who really need it and obviously are working and can afford it instead of just, jacking the prices up so hard to make it so astronomical that, people have no other choice but to live in their vehicles.
Right. It's like they said, though, the supply and demand, when the demand is very heavy, people want to take that cost way up there and see how much they can get.
Interesting. Well, Sergei Lavrov was critical of Europe's latest show of support for the U.S.'s planned pullout from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. The Russian foreign minister told Press TV, I'd like to see how our European colleagues use their independence in real case scenarios, but unfortunately they seem to not be quite ready for it, and they keep following the U.S. even if it brings them in conflict with their own interest.
Mr. Lavrov was referring to the most recent resolution backed by Moscow that would preserve the Cold War-era treaty, which European leaders failed to support. Now, while Europe has expressed concern over the U.S.'s threat to withdraw unilaterally from the treaty, which bans short and medium-range ballistic missiles in Europe, its vote against Russia's proposal now opens it up to the threat of American missiles, explained Lavrov.
Lavrov was clearly disappointed in Europe's decision and also stressed, should the U.S. decide to place their banned missiles in Europe, Russia would respond in like manner.
Well, besides his plans to remove America from the decades-old treaty, the U.S. president just announced he would be pulling U.S. troops out of Syria. However, bombing in the eastern part of the country has not stopped and has actually gained momentum. Why would this be? Well, to give us a glimpse of just what's been going on, let's take a look at this video.
It's about oil and power. It's about oil and power. It's about oil and power. And I think the fact that those two things are very crucial to the US economy and to Trump's position. Is something which is going to keep the Americans involved in Syria in one way or another for many, many years to come.
Well, Katan, interesting comments there from Mr. Farrell that oil and power, two things that are crucial to the U.S. economy, which means that the U.S. would in some way, some fashion or another, stay involved in Syria for years to come.
Oh, yeah, that's for sure. Well, the Iranian president says they will go ahead with exporting the country's oil as planned. He recently said, "It should be clear to our people that the Americans by no means will be able to achieve their objective with regards to stopping Iran from exporting oil, gaseous condensates, natural gas, and oil products."
Well, Rouhani also praised Iran's economic activity despite pressure from the U.S. Now, new figures have been released by the Central Bank of Iran showing a drop in prices in the production sector. The Iranian president also commented on President Trump's recent trip to visit U.S. troops in Iraq. He said the war-torn country is proof that Washington's Middle East policies are failing to bear fruit.
While it appears the U.S. is nowhere near ready to leave Syria, there are a lot of right-wing war hawks, as well as those leaning to the left, who are dismayed over President Trump's decision to do just that. But why are they wanting the U.S. to stay at war in Syria? Well, it seems like those who are for war don't care where or what the United States is fighting for, just as long as they are at war with someone.
Well, if war is what they want, though, they might get more than they're bargaining for. Now, former Pentagon official Michael Maloof has been watching the U.S. moves and thinks Iran will be engaged before too long. In an interview with RT, he pointed out the fact that U.S. troops are being pulled out of Afghanistan, Syria, and even South Korea. However, he doesn't think they will be going home, but heading to Iraq instead.
Now, if you remember, Jeff, President Trump said in his New Year's Eve speech to the troops when he went there and actually visit with them and spoke with them, he said that they would remain in Iraq and be ready to go back to Syria. You know, so I don't think they're really looking for that. They probably want to go home with their families, but
he said we're going to keep an eye on Iran.
Yeah, keep an eye on Iran. So you know, the plans aren't really to, you know, reduce the troops in foreign nations. It's to just transfer them from one place to another.
Well, Mr. Maloof told RT, this is speculation, but Iraq could become the new hub for U.S. Middle East policy for the positioning of these troops, and this is sort of a continuation from John Bolton's activities from 2013. So why the buildup of troops in Iraq? Well, Maloof sees it as a launching point from which the U.S. could engage Iran, being that it's right next door. And if you remember, the interesting thing there about his comments, that Iran was one of those countries that the retired General Wesley Clark mentioned years ago that the U.S. would be going after. And, you know, so far there hasn't really been a war there yet between the U.S. and Iran, even though they've been, you know, looking for the weapons of mass destruction and all of these type of things here. But it's interesting that they're not pulling the troops out, or they're pulling them out of some countries, but it's really just a relocating them still in the Middle East area there, but positioning them, like they said, to be right next door to Iran.
Yeah, and let's not forget that Iran is an ally of Syria, which the U.S. is at war with, and of course, kind of counteracting Russia, who is kind of on the side of Syria, and we see that whole area in and around that area of the river Euphrates, which we know has been a hot spot for war activity. And like you mentioned before, as one of the articles talked about, the oil as being a big factor. And where there's oil, it seems like the U.S. is always going to be around somewhere.
That's right.
To make sure that they get their share.
Well, if you'd like to find out more about these stories and others, you can contact the House of Yahweh. And when you do, don't forget to request your free copy of the Prophetic Word magazine and monthly newsletter. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites by going to yahweh.com, yisraelhawkins.com, or yahwehsbranch.com. You can also visit our website by going to YPNnews.com. You can also email the House of Yahweh at info@yahweh.com. And for all calls outside the United States, please dial the number on your screen. And of course, don't forget the best resource to studying the Holy Scriptures, the online free version of the Yisrael Says and Ask Yisrael program. And you can find those by merely going to YisraelSays.com and AskYisrael.com.
Well, grab your Holy Scriptures, a notebook, and something to write with. Up next is another exciting message from Yisrael Hawkins that you certainly don't want to miss. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
And I'm Katan Alexander.
Thanks for watching.